Time later, I remember thinking that silence can be more uncomfortable than any argument, especially when someone is expecting a fight. Daniel shifted slightly in the booth across from me, as if he was waiting for the moment I would finally respond, but I did not give him that moment. Instead, I lifted the coffee mug slowly and took a small sip, letting the warmth settle while the noise of the diner returned to its quiet rhythm around us. Plates clinked softly somewhere behind the counter, and the doorbell chimed as another customer walked in from the cool October air. When I placed the mug back on the table, Daniel was watching me closely, his expression somewhere between frustration and disbelief. It was clear that my calm reaction had not been part of the conversation he imagined. For a moment, he opened his mouth as if to add something else, then hesitated, perhaps wondering why his words had not produced the reaction he expected. Finally, he leaned forward again and repeated himself, this time more directly, saying that Linda had stepped into his father's life and provided the kind of support that had been missing for years. He spoke about financial planning and organization, about new ideas for the future, about how different things looked now compared to the past. The more he talked, the more confident he seemed in the version of the story he believed. I listened carefully, nodding once or twice, not because I agreed, but because I wanted him to finish completely. People reveal far more when they believe they are finally being heard. After a while, his voice lowered slightly, but the sharp edge in it remained. He said that maybe it was time I admitted that I had never really understood his father the way Linda did. That sentence floated across the table and settled between us like a challenge. A few customers at nearby tables were still pretending not to notice our conversation, though their quiet glances told a different story. I folded my hands together on the table and looked at Daniel the way I used to when he was a teenager, trying to explain a decision he had already made in his mind. I felt no anger, only a calm awareness that the conversation had reached exactly the point he had been driving toward since the moment I walked through the diner door. For several seconds I said nothing at all. Then I gave a small nod, not an agreement, but an acknowledgment that he had finished speaking. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as if he was trying to read something in my face that he could not quite understand. The silence between us stretched long enough that even the waitress glanced over again while wiping down a nearby table. Finally, I reached for the napkin beside my plate and placed it neatly next to the coffee cup. My chair slid back softly as I stood up from the booth. Daniel looked surprised, perhaps realizing that the reaction he had expected was not going to happen. I met his eyes calmly and spoke only one quiet sentence before stepping away from the table. I told him that some decisions in life protect a family for many years, even when people do not realize it yet. Then I picked up my purse, walked toward the door of the diner, and stepped back into the cool autumn sunlight outside, leaving Daniel sitting alone with a story he believed was complete, even though the most important part had not begun to reveal itself. I stepped out of the diner, and the cool Ohio air wrapped around me like a quiet reminder that the world outside that small conversation had not changed at all. Cars continued moving along the street. A bus stopped at the corner to let passengers off, and somewhere down the block a dog barked at nothing in particular. Ordinary life continued exactly the same, even though something inside my own family had shifted in a way that Daniel did not yet understand. I walked slowly toward the parking lot behind the diner, the crisp October leaves crunching softly beneath my shoes. My hands were steady as I unlocked my car door and sat down behind the wheel. For a moment, I simply sat there looking through the windshield at the rows of trees lining the street. Their branches were already turning deep shades of gold and red, the kind of quiet beauty people often overlook when they are busy arguing about things they do not fully understand. Daniel believed that lunch had been the end of a conversation. In truth, it had only been the beginning of something much larger. I started the engine and drove home through the familiar neighborhoods of Columbus, passing houses that looked almost identical to the ones Daniel had grown up around as a child. Brick homes with tidy front lawns, mailboxes standing beside the sidewalk, bicycles resting against garage doors. For years our family life had looked just as ordinary from the outside. No one driving past our house would have known how carefully every major decision had been planned behind those walls. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun had begun drifting lower in the sky. The house stood quietly exactly the way it always had, the white porch railing freshly painted and the small maple tree in the front yard scattering leaves across the walkway. I carried my purse inside, and placed it gently on the kitchen counter before walking toward the small study at the back of the house. That room had always been my quiet place, the one space where important papers were organized in neat folders inside a wide oak cabinet. Many years earlier, I had learned that stability rarely happens by accident. Families stay secure because someone pays attention to details long before anyone else thinks they matter. I opened the cabinet and pulled out a thin folder labeled with my name and the date from nearly 15 years ago. The paper inside was still crisp, the signatures clear beneath the careful lines of legal print. I sat down at the desk and read the first page again, even though I already knew every word it contained. That document had been created during a time when Daniel was still young enough to believe that life would always remain simple. His father had been busy building his business then, often traveling for work while I handled the practical side of our household. Bills were paid on time, investments were reviewed, and long-term plans were made quietly in the background. None of those decisions had seemed dramatic at the time. They were simply the responsible choices someone makes when they want their family to remain safe no matter what the future brings. I closed the folder slowly and placed it back inside the cabinet. Daniel had spoken confidently that afternoon about changes in his father's life, and about new ideas being introduced by someone who had only recently joined the family. What he did not realize yet was that some of the most important decisions affecting our future had been written down long before those new voices ever appeared. And sometimes the quietest plans are the ones that shape everything that happens later. The house was quiet that evening in a way that felt almost peaceful, the kind of silence that only comes after a long day when the sun begins to fade behind the trees and the neighborhood slowly settles into its evening rhythm. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it into the living room, sitting down in the same armchair where I had spent countless evenings over the years reviewing documents and planning the practical side of our family's life. Some people believe that stability simply appears when things are going well, but I learned a long time ago that stability is something you build carefully, piece by piece, often without anyone noticing the work behind it. Daniel had never been interested in those details. When he was younger, he cared about school, sports, and later his career, which was exactly what a young man should focus on. I had never expected him to worry about financial structures or legal agreements. That was my responsibility for many years, especially during the times when his father was traveling constantly to grow his business. I took another sip of tea and glanced toward the hallway where the small study door remained slightly open. Inside that room were the files that quietly held the story Daniel had never taken the time to learn. 15 years earlier, there had been a period when the economy looked uncertain and several friends of ours had lost large portions of their savings because they trusted the wrong advice. I remember sitting at the same desk with a legal pad full of notes, reviewing different options with a careful patience that only comes from wanting to protect the people you love. That was when I first contacted Michael Grant, a respected attorney in Columbus who specialized in long-term financial planning for families. Michael had explained that there were ways to structure certain assets so they remained protected even if circumstances inside a family changed over time. At that moment, I had not imagined how important that conversation would eventually become. Back then, the idea was simply to make sure Daniel's future would remain secure no matter what happened in the years ahead. I still remember sitting across from Michael in his office as he outlined several possibilities, drawing small diagrams on a sheet of paper while explaining how ownership structures and authorization requirements could quietly safeguard important investments. The process required patience and careful documentation, but once it was completed, the arrangement would remain in place for many years unless everyone involved agreed to change it. I had listened carefully to every detail before signing the final papers, knowing that most people never realize how valuable those quiet protections can be until much later in life. That decision had never been about control or pride. It had always been about stability. Daniel had grown up in a home where the lights were always on, the mortgage was always paid, and the future always felt secure. Children rarely ask how those things happen. They simply assume life works that way. I finished my tea and placed the empty cup on the small table beside the chair. Somewhere across town, Daniel was probably still thinking about the conversation in the diner, confident that he had finally spoken the truth he believed needed to be said. What he did not yet realize was that curiosity has a way of growing quietly after a moment like that. Sooner or later, questions begin to appear, especially when someone starts discussing finances and long-term plans. And when those questions finally reached the right place, Daniel was going to discover that some of the most important decisions in our family had been made long before anyone began comparing loyalty or support. Sometimes the person who appears silent in a conversation is simply the one who already understands how the story will unfold. 3 days passed after that lunch, and during those days I continued my normal routines without changing anything in my schedule. I went grocery shopping on Monday morning, watered the small plants on my back porch, and spent part of the afternoon organizing old photographs that had been sitting in a box in the hallway closet for years. Life has a quiet way of continuing forward even when conversations linger in your mind. I thought about Daniel only occasionally, mostly when I remembered the expression on his face at the diner when he expected me to argue. Silence had unsettled him more than anger ever could. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel was beginning to experience something that often follows a heated conversation. At first, it was only a small question in the back of his mind. During the drive home from the diner, he had replayed the conversation several times, confident that he had finally said what needed to be said. But by the second day, a different thought appeared. If Linda had been helping his father reorganize finances, as he claimed during lunch, then there must have been documents involved. Daniel had always considered himself a practical man, someone who believed in understanding how things worked. Curiosity led him to open a few old emails his father had sent months earlier mentioning financial planning meetings. One of those messages contained the name of an attorney Daniel vaguely remembered hearing years ago, Michael Grant. The name stirred a distant memory from Daniel's childhood, something about his parents visiting a lawyer's office long ago during a time when the economy had been uncertain. By Wednesday afternoon, curiosity finally pushed Daniel to make a phone call. The office of Michael Grant was located in a quiet brick building near downtown Columbus, a place that had served families in the community for decades. When Daniel introduced himself to the receptionist and explained that he was the son of Robert Walker, the receptionist politely told him that Mr. Grant was available for a short conversation. A few minutes later, Daniel found himself speaking with the same attorney who had helped design our family's financial structure many years earlier. Michael Grant's voice was calm and professional as he greeted Daniel and asked how he could help. Daniel explained that he had recently been discussing financial planning with his father and wanted to understand how certain investments were organized. For a brief moment, there was silence on the line while the attorney reviewed something on his computer. Then Michael Grant spoke carefully, choosing his words with the kind of precision that experienced lawyers develop over time. He told Daniel that the primary investment structure for the Walker family had been established years ago through a legal arrangement that involved several authorization requirements. Daniel asked what that meant in practical terms. The answer that followed was simple but unexpected. Michael Grant explained that certain assets connected to the Walker family portfolio could not be modified, transferred, or reorganized without the formal consent of the original co-authorizing party. Daniel asked who that person was. The attorney paused briefly before answering in a calm, steady voice. He said that the co-authorizing party listed in the documents was Margaret Walker. In other words, the quiet woman who had walked out of the diner 3 days earlier was still legally connected to the very financial structure Daniel believed had recently been reorganized. I spent the next 2 days exactly the way I usually do, waking early in the morning, opening the kitchen window to let the cool Ohio air drift inside, and starting the day with a quiet cup of coffee while the neighborhood slowly came to life. Retirement had given me the gift of patience, and patience has a way of making time feel slower and clearer. I watered the small maple tree in my backyard, spoke briefly with my neighbor while she walked her dog along the sidewalk, and later that afternoon I stopped by the local grocery store for a few simple things I needed for dinner. There was nothing dramatic about those days, and that was exactly the point. Life rarely announces the moment when understanding begins to change. Often it starts quietly, inside someone else's thoughts, far away from where you are standing. Across town, Daniel had been thinking about the phone call with Michael Grant far more than he expected. At first, he tried to explain it away, telling himself that the arrangement must have been outdated or irrelevant now that his father had begun working with new advisors. But the more he reviewed the conversation, the more clearly he remembered the attorney's careful words. The legal structure had never been replaced, and the authorization requirement connected to Margaret Walker was still active. That detail refused to disappear from his mind. By Friday afternoon, Daniel found himself sitting alone in his office long after most of his coworkers had left for the weekend. The sunlight outside the tall glass windows had begun fading into the softer colors of early evening, while the city streets below filled with the slow movement of cars heading home. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at his phone resting on the desk in front of him. For several minutes, he did not touch it. Calling his mother now felt very different from the confident attitude he had carried into that diner earlier in the week. Back then he had believed he understood the situation clearly. Now the conversation with the attorney had opened a door he had never considered before. Eventually Daniel picked up the phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found my name. His thumb hovered above the call button for a moment before he pressed it. When the phone rang in my kitchen that evening, I was preparing a simple dinner while soft music played from a small radio on the counter. I glanced at the screen and saw Daniel's name appear. That alone told me something had changed. My son was not a man who made many casual calls. I answered calmly and greeted him the same way I always had. On the other end of the line, Daniel hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. His voice sounded quieter now, lacking the sharp certainty that had filled the diner days earlier. He asked if I had a moment to talk. I told him of course I did. There was a short pause before he continued, and I could almost hear the weight of his thoughts as he chose his words. Daniel said that earlier in the week he had spoken with Michael Grant about the financial arrangements connected to his father's investments. He said the attorney had mentioned my name. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall while I listened. Then Daniel asked a careful question that revealed everything about how his understanding had begun to change. He asked if it was true that those arrangements had been created many years ago and that my authorization was still part of the structure today.